Symposium. So this is a really exciting event that we've been working towards for a long time. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we hope to do today is we have invited a lot of people that really have worked on historic apple trees across the state. So we're going to hear from many of those people. We're also going to hear from some CU students doing research on our local apple trees, and give you a little bit of an overview about what we're trying to do and what we've been finding right here in Boulder. So I want to start by changing this. Okay, so I want to just start by giving you kind of some overview. I think one thing that's really special about historic apple trees and all the interest in the community about these is that people are coming at their interests in so many different ways. You know, they have a special tree in their backyard. They know a lot about the history of the community and how much the apple trees have a strong cultural significance here. Maybe they're interested in growing trees or making cider. So there's a lot of different ways that we're linking together through apple trees. I want to thank the University of Colorado for supporting our efforts in this project, as well as the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities. We're one of the projects under their umbrella for their support. So what is the Boulder Apple Tree Project? I just want to give you a quick kind of overview. I know that a lot of people have been involved with this. But this started about 3 years ago, and it actually started because I moved back from Colorado. I grew up in Colorado. I moved back to join the faculty at CU, and I ran across this old, like really, really old apple tree in just an abandoned field next to the house that we moved into. And I thought I knew Colorado really well, and I was astonished that this tree was there, and astonished that no one was taking care of this tree, and it was still growing really well, it was still producing all this fruit. And for some reason, that really made a really strong impact on me. And so I started asking questions to people about these trees, and if anyone's studying these trees, and how much people know about these trees. And it actually turns out that people didn't know how many trees there were, but there was a lot of people that were interested in it. So that's how it started. Our mission is to think about both the ecological and cultural heritage of these trees, mostly in Boulder County and then throughout the Front Range, and think about preserving these trees and their stories, the history that they represent, so that they can be enjoyed and also used. There's really important biological diversity here to be used for future generations. And second, or lastly, to further kind of locally relevant and community-engaged research that's happening at CU. So really tying in to our educational mission and leading and having students be really involved in this research. So just as a little bit of background, Colorado has amazing apple tree heritage, and this is from the western slope as well as here. A lot of people, when they moved to Colorado from the east, they would bring with them saplings or seeds of their favorite apple tree, or they would plant trees when they moved here for drink, for food, and also for some commercial enterprises. And there are a lot of orchards here. There's an orchard in Chautauqua. There was an orchard in there was an orchard where our chancellor's house is right now. There's orchards throughout all North Boulder. There's also a lot of really old trees that are in front of old homesteads, right? So the old family trees that are still alive. The interesting thing here is that they're not going to be alive for much longer. All this activity was happening in the 1870s, 1890s, 1920s is about the last of the real large plantings of apples around here. So most of these trees are reaching the ends of their lives. So what are we doing? So our first goal is to try to rediscover, if that's an appropriate word, these old trees. I say it's not quite appropriate because a lot of people know of these trees and love these trees, but really document and map where they are, what are their characteristics, and also who they are. So trying to identify cultivars. We've gone all over the place, and I have to say, we have found trees in all crazy places throughout Boulder. In the middle of the wilds, like in the middle of, you wouldn't expect anyone living there, to in front of old homesteads, in people's backyards. In total, we have surveyed for 600 trees. They all are tagged with our Boulder Apple Tree Project. If you're interested, if you find a tree that you think we should tag and it hasn't a tag, we have information about how to do that. In the trees that we have looked at trying to use genetic techniques to identify, we have identified 43 cultivars, some of those historic, some of those not, but then we're also able to map those heritage cultivars and know where they are. Tie those special cultivars to special stories and history, right? And then that would be our next step to complete about which of these trees would we really prioritize for maintaining or preserving in community orchards. So this is just one sample of the type of information that we're starting to get throughout this community. This is our some of our samples from 2018. We've done this 3 years. One other really interesting thing is that we find that there's at least 24 cultivars that are missing from the USDA's reference database. So these are trees that match other trees in Boulder. So these are trees that someone is grafting, someone is cultivating. So it must be a good tree for some reason. We don't know quite any more than that. But that they are not widespread throughout all of New England or all of the United States. So these might be really particularly special trees to us here. They might be really locally well adapted to our climate. They might be really important to particular regions. We know from historical records that there was a cultivar named Hygiene, one named Longmont, one named St. Vrain. So wouldn't that be great if we could start identifying those and saving those? And of course, those aren't going to be in the national database. They still might be really important to us here. And then lastly, we're tying this into education, and we're thinking about the real importance of the power of place. Okay, so thinking about how do you get involved in research? How do you get involved thinking you want to be a scientist? And the idea that doing something that's locally relevant and community engaged might be one way where we can make learning and training really, really relevant and really kind of open up that door to more people than might normally expect that they would grow up to be a scientist or a researcher or a historian. And so we'll hear a little bit more about that later on. Our vision moving forward is kind of a couple things, but I just want to highlight some things that you'll hear about a little bit more. We have plans for a community teaching orchard. CU is supporting this and has identified an area on 30th Street by the Boulder Creek Trail that we actually could collect some of these really important trees to our community and actually establish a community teaching orchard is how I'm thinking about it. So some place that everyone can walk through and experience all these different cultivars, all the amazing diversity, but then also have it be an outdoor lab, right? A laboratory for people to learn about botany, plant biology. Also trying to reach more students with these efforts, and certainly trying to really preserve these unique trees that we're finding. I want to say thank you to our team. This is a real group effort with people from a broad array of expertise. You'll see many of these people, actually all these people here today, and so please, well, I thank them, and please ask them any questions you might have about any of the things that you hear today. So what's our plan for today? So today, the goal is just kind of celebrate what we know and what we're finding out about these amazing historic trees. We first will hear from Jude Schuenmeyer, who has led, along with his wife Addie, the Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project, which is a national leader in this community-based preservation effort of orchards. They are based in Southwest Colorado, but they're a leader throughout the whole region. Then we will stop and see the posters that CU students have made to share their research on local apples, everything from the physiology to the genetics to the urban ecology of what we have right here. Then we will reconvene and hear from Gail Vogt, who is a scientist at the Genetic Resource Preservation Laboratory, USDA in Fort Collins. He is a global leader in the conservation of apples in the wide diversity that exists. And then lastly, we'll end with a community panel with 4 experts in different aspects about why apples might be really important to us here. Daniel Haken, who owns a Haken Family Cider. Eric Johnson, who is the lead, co-lead of Widespread Malice, a community group. Scott Scoberby, who's a horticulturalist in Fort Collins, an apple expert. Hannah Tyrell Wasowski, who is the executive director of Community Fruit Rescue. That will be moderated by Sharon Collins, who's the lead of the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities. Okay, so thank you very much for coming. I'm going to start by handing this over to Jude to talk about heritage apples in Colorado and the Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Kate. Thanks everyone here at CU. Thank you guys all for being here. A big thanks to Amy for helping to get us up here and getting us set when we were here. Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project started unintentionally many years ago when Addie and I realized, my wife Addie and I realized that not only were there a lot of old trees down in Montezuma County, but these old trees represented a really unusual set of genetics there, and that they together were part of a bigger orchard economy that happened there, and the remnants of it. We are so fortunate to get to do what we get to do. We are so grateful to get to do what we get to do, and we are so glad to be able to be here and sharing all of this with you. Today is going to be a little bit of a hybrid between what we do, apple exploring wise, and the history of orchards in Colorado that we're working on as part of the state historic context on orchards. So 20 years ago, Addie and I went into the nursery business on a whim, leasing out an old neighborhood nursery that had been in Cortez for over 50 years. Along with the nursery, we wound up inheriting the customers that had been there, the old Montezuma County natives. And they would tell us stories of their grandparents' orchard. They would give us historic information from county fair records and old clippings from the newspapers. They would ask us to get them varieties of old-time apples they knew as a kid. They reminded us that orchards, they told us about the people that planted the orchards and reminded us that orchards were something to be passed down from generation to generation. Though Jasper Hull had been dead for 20 years, by the time that photo was taken in 1937, his orchard rows are still as clear as day. As we did our research and learned more, we came to know that Montezuma County was part of a bigger story of orchards in Colorado. This may be a little bit familiar ground for you guys. It looks a little different here. Colorado, there's the Flatirons. You are right about here. Colorado was part of a larger context of orchards in America at this time. None of this happened in its own little bubble. It was all part of a bigger happening. America in the 1880s was considered the golden age of pomology. When we started looking through, when these folks would ask us to get them the old-time varieties, you got to remember this was a world before Google, so we had to use books and we had to use catalogs to find these varieties for them. And as we looked through the books and magazines, we realized that a lot of what was on these county fair lists was very rare. Sure, there was Delicious and Rome Beauty and Jonathan, but there was also Thunderbolt and Walbridge and Winter Banana, Missouri Pippin, and it made us aware of how rare a lot of what we had around us was. Made us aware that a lot of what happened there was not just small homestead orchards, but part of a much longer, much bigger economy that had happened there. Walbridge here was an example of an apple that would have been planted along the Front Range here by the thousands. It's now considered extinct to functionally extinct. When William Cox wrote his book on apples in America in the early 1800s, he listed about 133 of the most esteemed apples in America. When W.L. Reagan published Nomenclature of the Apples of the early 1900s, he listed over 17,000 varieties of apples. Pioneers in Colorado started planting orchards at the peak of this period of genetic diversity. At the time when they started planting these orchards, no one knew how cold Colorado was, no one knew how hot the summers were, how dry it was. Previous to the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, Colorado was a place to go around, so they threw everything out that they possibly could. We were the great benefactors of the great genetic diversity happening. A lot of what we know from the State Board of Horticultural reports. These were originally the State Bureau of Horticulture. In 1893, it became the State Board of Horticulture, a government agency. There was concern at the time that it would stop the growers themselves from being in control of it. By 1915, this became the report of the state horticulturist. We get to meet some of the most amazing people here. One of them was Martha Shute, longtime secretary for the State Board of Horticulture. She lost her job because she was a woman. She got it back because she was competent. I can't stress enough how CU has several of these in their library here. These are some of the most detailed conversations of what they were doing, why they were doing, and how they were doing. If you want to know why it happened, read those. There's two surveys that happened in Colorado that serve as opposite plates of a hinge. The first one was Charles Crandall's in 1891. Dr. Crandall celebrated the great diversity of apples in Colorado, and he was amazed at everything that could grow. The second set were by E.P. Sandston in the 1920s, and Sandston listed out every single apple grown in every single orchard around the state. For Sandston, his view of this was that there's too many different apples growing. We need to get rid of all of these different varieties. You should only have 3 or 4 different apples growing in orchards. All of this we've put together, all of this historic information we've been putting together to create the Colorado Apple List. We feel like there's probably about 500 apples that were grown historically in Colorado. About half of those are now considered lost. We don't want this to be just a piece of paper. We use the list, cross-referencing what was lost versus unknown apples we find, to see if we can match a name to varieties that we no longer know what they are. Some of these we'll never know, but our job is to preserve them. So when we think of orchards in Colorado, most of us think of the Western District. Palisades Peaches comes to mind, right? When first people looked at the Western Slope, they thought it was a barren wasteland. William Pabor, early secretary of the State Board of Horticulture, saw it as great potential fruit-growing country. As soon as the utes were forcibly removed there, they started planting trees in the tracks of the freshly departing utes. Though they planted peaches, they also planted apples by the millions. Starting in the early 1900s, they had problems with soil salinity, which was correctable, but they also had infestations, endemic infestations of codling moth, and it became it became the policy of the Extension Service to tell people to cut out their old trees as a way of getting rid of the codling moth. The area around Fruita now has very few trees left. For practical purposes, Delta County, or Mesa County got rid of its apple orchards. The earliest orchard we know planted in Colorado was from hardscrabble up above Florence. The earliest known successful commercial orchard we know was planted by Jesse Frazier there in Florence. There's gobs of stories of Jesse Frazier coming across the plains on an ox-drawn wagon from the St. Louis, Illinois borderlands in the early 1860s, leaving a land torn apart by civil war to take great risks out in Colorado. Jesse Frazier planted thousands of trees. He had thousands of trees die. He persisted until by the 1880s and 1890s he was considered to have the finest orchards in all of Colorado. Jesse Frazier also is credited as having one of the first, if not the first, nurseries in Colorado. He had a tremendous impact on us with orchards because he was also selling trees. He's one of the most important forgotten people in the history of Colorado. There's an apple that we associate a lot with Jesse Frazier, and this is the Colorado orange. This was originally a grafted tree that the graft died, but because the rootstock was growing where it needed to in an orchard row, he decided to let it grow. We found this is one of the few apples that ever made it out of Colorado. It was used in the Minnesota plant breeding program. It was featured in start catalogs. We thought we had had this a few years ago when somebody from Canyon City told us they had one. They had people back in the 90s that were in their 90s say, yes, this is a Colorado orange apple. We were able to DNA test this a couple of years ago, and when we DNA tested it, instead of being a Colorado orange, it came back a York Imperial. At the same time, we had another person from another orchard over in Colorado, or in Canyon City area, tell us that they also had a Colorado orange apple. They took us to a tree several years ago. We took cuttings of it. We were able to DNA test it. That came back Ben Davis. 2 years ago, we were there in December in Canyon City. They took us to the tree again, but they took us to a different tree. This time, underneath this tree on audit, there were these orange-looking apples. We were able to send a sample of this to DNA testing that Nick Howard through the University of Minnesota is doing. This came back unique unknown this time. So Nick Howard's comment was, we don't know if it is it or not. You've got to find a botanical specimen to compare it to. This tree is believed to be extinct. Now, fortunately for us, there was a person called Miriam Palmer from CSU that did watercolor sketches of apples from county fairs in the early 1900s. She then made wax cast of these. These had been sitting around in a professor's office up there for years, not knowing what they got. We alerted him to the fact that CSU has an archives and let Linda Meyer know that they have it. Yesterday we took samples of this apple up there to CSU and matched them, and we feel like we found this apple now. It matches pretty well. Now it's getting enough of amount to be able to preserve it. We also think we found another one from the Miriam Palmer collection that was unlabeled, but we feel like we matched it as a Colorado orange sample also. I cannot tell you how valuable that is. Wax apple collections are extraordinarily rare. They're extremely perishable. This one has had some heat damage. This is literally one of the most priceless artifacts in Colorado orchards, in the history of Colorado orchards that exist. For those of you who do research, I would encourage you to go up there and look at it sometime and see it. If the Southeast District was about the Arkansas River and its drainages, the Northeast District here was about the Platte River and its drainages. This is from the South Denver suburbs all the way up to the Wyoming border. This is William and Henry Lee on Clear Creek. This is the orchards in Chautauqua. This is George Webster along the St. Vrain, James McClelland along Fossil Creek. This is the one-man experimental station Charles Pennock at Bellevue west of Fort Collins. Initially, the Northeast District benefited greatly from the fact that it was so close to population centers, they had a great market for their fruit. As codling moth came into these orchards in the late 1800s, the value of the apple crop dropped to the point to where the land was worth more for development for the increasing populations in this area than were the orchards. Up north, these were converted over to cherry orchards, and there were massive amounts of especially pie cherries planted. Got to thank Scott Skogerbo for sending us this about a 6-7 page list of Charles Pennock's nursery catalog. This is down in the southwest district where we are from. Jasper Hall was called the Fruit Wizard of Montezuma County. He originally started off down by our farm in the Como Canyon near the Utah border. In the early 1900s, he moved north of Cortez up into the Pinyon Juniper area, and everyone thought he was crazy. They said you cannot grow apples at that high of an altitude. He saw the lay of the land and that the cold air slid off and proved them badly wrong. Montezuma County, the southwest district, E.P. Sanson in the 1920s said it could be the best orchard district in Colorado, but not for the difficulty of getting the apples to a market. We are still a long ways down in a remote place. Because we were so remote, Montezuma County did make the change from these very diverse orchards to the big megalithic monocultural orchards that happened from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. There's a great Jasper Hall quote that he said, "If there's something happens you don't know, don't be afraid to ask your neighbors, as we all live and learn as time goes by." An apple we associate a lot with Jasper Hall is the winter banana. The place where that aerial photo was taken, there were 2 trees left that we traced to Jasper Hall. One was called the Jasper Hall jelly crab, which is a transcendent, I think. The other one was a winter banana. Down the road from that orchard is this orchard that has about 20 of these 100-and-something-year-old winter banana trees. It's big, spectacular, spectacular trees. Winter banana is a dynamite apple. It's a perfect balance between sweet and acidity to it. It's a real mild flavor. It's easily one of my favorites. It's also used a lot as a pollinator. It's a great pollinating orchard. What brought us here to the Hover orchard, though, was not the winter banana. It was a different apple altogether, one called the Thunderbolt. Thunderbolt was the first apple we saw in the historic records that we were like, you know, we should go see if we could find one of those around growing out in the county still. So we asked a lot of old people, and eventually someone introduced us to the Hovers, and the Hovers said they had it. We've since found a few others. This apple we can tie through State Board of Horticultural reports directly to Jasper Hall, bringing it in to Colorado from Tennessee. It's extremely rare to know who brought an apple here to Colorado, but we know Jasper Hall did this. The Thunderbolt is a winter apple. Winter apples tend to not be blowaway right off the tree unless you've had a hard freeze especially. They were meant to go into storage and be pulled out Christmas and after. In a world before refrigeration, that was an incredibly important thing to have. Have these long-keeping apples that you could pull and eat until June or July of the following year. So early on, we learned that apples grow on trees, and if you want to find the old-time varieties, you got to find the old trees, right? This is an old tree down in Florence. We're looking north here. That's the shoulder of Pikes Peak in the background. We feel like anecdotally we can try this tree directly back to Jesse Frazier. It's very close to his place. If you look at this tree, there is something that tells us that it's an older tree. Starting in the 1880s, most trees were low head open bowl. So in other words, the scaffolding, the branching would start off a couple feet above the ground. If you look at it, this branching starts off way above the ground. This tree probably predates barbed wire is the reason for that. Once barbed wire happened, you could remove the animals from the trees, from the orchards, and start pruning them down lower. We were able to DNA test this tree. It came back unique unknown, which means it has no match to it. You guys, I'm sure today will hear a bit more about DNA. You got to remember that the Applecestry.com is a fairly new thing to be able to pull off with DNA. And before we had that, we still had to use those books again. And these books are great. Within these books, there's great resources for Apple ID. In the upper corner is Edward Bunyard's book from England in the 1920s. And what Bunyard did was he put the shape of the apple across the top and the seasoning ripening going down the side. Hogg, also from England, Robert Hogg, also from England, decided to look more at the anatomical structures of the apple, whether it's the carpels, the calyx tube, the position of the stamens. He thought that was a better way to identify apples. Apple identification has always been extraordinarily hard and extraordinarily confusing. If there was an easy way to do it, somebody would have done it a lot easier a long, long time ago. Spencer Beach in the Apples of New York has a few pages on Apple ID. He used photographs instead of line drawings. When we compared the different markers that Beach used to identify apples and apple trees to one of the more common apples like Baldwin he put in there, we found about 25 different characteristics that he used to identify apples. All of these things are 2 or 3 pages in books that are dedicated to listing out lots of different apple varieties and why you should plant them. In my mind, it's some of the most dense and difficult reading you will ever do. And if you could spend within 4 or 5 years, you can get a functional handle on the information in those books and those few pages. I think you're doing really well for yourself. Whenever Addie and I ID apples, we pull out those lists and we go through them. I'll put in a plug. The most important work on apples in America just came out within the last few years. This is Dan Bussey's 7-volume set. They only printed 3,000 copies of this. It is going out of publication soon. I would strongly encourage, if CU doesn't have it, I would encourage anybody who's doing a lot of work with apples to have this. Books work differently than the internet. They really do. They think differently. We think differently. Another great source was the USDA pomological collection of watercolors. This was originally started with the new USDA in the 1870s, and as people sent them more apples going, what are those? They sent out more artists to record these and to get them how they are. We were able, looking at county fair records and the pomological data, to find in a homestead orchard, an orchard with about a dozen trees, with one of these, one of these, one of these, this large summer apple, the apple's about as big as the kid's head, that we were able to then say, okay, this is a summer Rambo. When we got the DNA on it, the DNA was probable summer Rambo, the probable being because of the control of the DNA. All of these tools have to be used together to identify apples, though. You can't use any one of them in isolation. So a couple of years ago, we were really fortunate, as part of a USDA Colorado Specialty Crop Block Grant, to run DNA samples on apples. We were able to run about 500 samples, and out of those, 68, about 7 round numbers here, about 70 of them came back known cultivars. Some of them were delicious and Ben Davis common things. Some of them were like primate and American summer pearmain, very rare varieties. 31 of these matched other cultivars, but nothing else. So there's like 2 sets of trees in the orchard at Old Fort Lewis that match each other, but they don't match anything else on earth. There were about 100, just under 100 of these that came back unique unknown. When we were collecting samples, we were trying to make sure that we stuck to trees with graft lines, trees growing in orchard rows if we didn't see the graft lines. We know a tree growing along the road or along a ditch bank is a seedling and will therefore be unique unknown. We didn't need to test those. Out of almost 500 samples, we had almost 200 different cultivars. So the tree behind us there is, our marker on that is WAYP001. And if you guys look at this tree is growing sort of parallel to the Earth's surface. The natural state for apple trees should be more perpendicular to the Earth's surface. When they get like that, they're probably not long left for this world. Sometimes the best we do is preserve them through documentation. Now we have been able to get grafts of this tree. We were able to do DNA testing. This is a tree that matched other samples down in Arizona, I believe. An old-timer, Leon Reisenhofer, gave us the best advice we've ever gotten on how to tell what an apple or an apple tree is. He said, make tracks around trees, and lots of them. When we started trying to go out and propagate trees, we realized that we also needed to map them. It didn't do us any good to get an apple cutting from a tree over there and not know where it came from. What originally started off with hand-drawn maps on whatever scrap of paper has now gotten to a pretty high-end GIS system that enables us to do detailed maps that both shows the clustering of orchards and the actual trees plus every historic feature that goes with them. I think right now we're doing some of the better mapping around. This is over north of Durango in the Humosa area. This is the same orchard you saw the overhead map of. This is where the 416 fire was, and this almost got obliterated a couple of years ago. This orchard, when we talk about orchards here, Dr. Susan Dolan in her Context of Orchards in America put 1800 to 1880 as the golden age of apples and apple diversification in America, and from 1881 till 1946 is an era of standardization. For us, that got pushed back. You don't see standard orchards happening more monocultural orchards happening until after 1920. This house goes back to 1888. It's a beautiful old Victorian there in the Hermosa drainage. We feel like most of the orchards planted, this would have probably been about an 1880 orchard. You can see the different varieties that grow in there. Salmon group is not a type of apple, it's a grouping, it's just an arbitrary color group. When we're out in these old orchards, a lot of times we see apples that look alike, okay? You start to see similar ones going round and round. This is an apple that's oblate, so it's wider than it is tall. It was very hard-ribbed. It's a very high-quality winter apple. After a while, we sort of suspected that this was a Wagner, and fortunately for us, the DNA confirmed that it was. This is an apple you guys should know here. This is one you will see that was planted around Colorado pretty extensively. This is one of the few apples that rated very good to exceptional taste-wise. So we get all these points, we get all the dots, we get all the stories, we get all the stuff, and you've got to have some place to put all of this. We were really fortunate when we started that one of our founding board members, Brian Shanks, was an archaeologist that was really good at interrelationship databases. It's not enough to have numbers. You've got to be able to put this in a way that's relatable and shareable. To us, a database is not just something that exists in a computer. For us, it's the stories that the people told us about their orchards, about their grandparents' orchards. It's all of the historic record for the mighty industry that once happened there, all of the accumulated wealth that went with it. It's the old artifacts that we find around here. This is one of the oldest apple rollers we've ever seen. I think it got rebuilt multiple times, but that's a 1 in a million. It's the homesteads that went with the homestead orchard that looks like they got left in place. It's Eugene Watkins and his son Clark standing in front of an old Wolf River tree holding the silver medal that their grandmother Maple Rollicker won at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, the Louisiana Purchase Centennial Exhibition. These people pass, these trees move on. Our ability to carry forward what was here is really, really important though. And that's where having the database that it can be all put into and be shared from is so important to us. We rely a lot on the stories of people to tell us what apples are. Sometimes culturally they forget what they are. Down at the Gold Medal Orchard in Nacomo, there was a tree that was Vivian Kenyon, 92-year-old Vivian Duncan Vinsel Kenyon called the summer snow. She said it was that because her grandmother told her it was a summer snow. This was one of the few apples we put in that we thought was going to be a seedling. On the first round of DNA testing, it came back unknown, but it matched samples over in the old Mormon orchards in Weber Canyon south of Mancos. On the second round, it actually came back as a Whitney crab. Not an exceptionally rare apple, but enough time had passed to where people forgot what it was. That's not uncommon for people to plant a tree and forget what they plant. Happens all the time, right? Done that before, Scott?
Yeah.
This is one of the old Mormon orchards down in Weber Canyon. The point of reference, the ridge in the background is Mesa Verde National Park. These are these beautiful old orchards. They were sort of planted with a communal aspect because the Mormons were communal, and they were sort of planted with a homestead orchardness to them too. Delicious is in here, but it's just an apple among apples. It's there with American Summer Pearmain. It's got multiple of these different color groups that we have no idea what they are, and we may never know what they are, but we know they are rare, and we know that we need to catch them, to graft them, to preserve them. These are some of the funnest orchards. These things are planted about 15 feet apart, whereas typically these older orchards are 25-foot grids. These ones were planted much closer. First time we saw this orchard was from the orchard below the Welty orchard in Sarah Miller's orchard, and this apple has polka dots, so it got known as Sarah's polka dot apple. We sent a picture of this to Dan Bussey, and Dan's like, I don't know what it is. Whenever you can send a picture to Dan Bussey and he doesn't know what it is, you know you've got something worth getting. This was an old American apple that was grown out, gained some prominence, but probably never got that famous. It's a very high quality summer apple, and it's a little bit sweet, which is really, really unusual for summer apples. It's also still one of the prettiest apples we've ever found. Throws horrible, horrible cyanide, very hard to propagate from. Here's a more common summer apple. If you guys saw this on a tree, this is elongated. Okay, so it's longer than it is wide. This was a really common summer apple for a long time, the Shenango strawberry. The reason why you would know it's not a delicious is because it ripens in August. This was an example of an apple. The summer apples were planted about 20% of an orchard in the old days. Would have been summer apples, 40% would have been fall varieties, 40% would have been winter varieties. Summer apples have gone heavily extinct. Many varieties have, because when we went into more monocultural orchards, people stopped growing them and stopped caring about them. Here's an apple you guys will see all over the place on Front Range, fair records, historic records, the Missouri Pippin. This was planted out a lot as an early producing, heavy producing apple early on. Sometimes they would put this in the rows of their permanent trees and then pull them out later. Sometimes they just liked planting them because it was a well-received in the market, high-value market crop. Every time we saw an old apple tree that was kind of small with a round red apple, we'll be like, aha, there's finally the Missouri Pippin. Of course, the Missouri Pippin tree that we found is a big, massive old tree over in Weber Canyon. Here's the orchard at Old Fort Lewis. Old Fort started out as a cavalry fort, then it became an Indian boarding school, process of assimilation. Then it became a normal high school, and then off to be the college. If you guys look, this is actually planted on terraces. We believe they used the child labor to pull the dirt down and create these swales. This is permaculture decades before permaculture ever happened. This is really unusual in that this orchard was planted about 1920-ish. By that point, most orchards were going towards monoculture. They were going to where they're mostly delicious Rome and Johnny. There is not a single delicious Rome or Johnny in this orchard that we have yet found. Instead, there's multiple unknown varieties that we know match other things, so we know they're all clone trees. There was a tree there we were sure was going to be a seedling. Could see a lot of root on it and no graft line. It came back matching a sample from Wyoming. The most common variety of apple we see in this one, both in terms of the number of apples in the orchard and the variety, is a wealthy. This is one of the, if there's 10 or 20, 10, 15 apples that you should know in Colorado that were historically grown here, this is one. This is the apple that Peter Gideon started the University of Minnesota plant breeding program with. It was planted a lot in Colorado because it has a reputation of being both high quality, it's a really good tasting apple, and very cold hardy. I will tell you the thing with this apple is that it's a round red apple. And as you guys go out and try and identify apples, round red apples have three things in common. They're round, they're red, and they're apples. It always makes distinguishing them a little bit harder. This is one that you guys start to see it, you will start to know it, and you will start to recognize it. If you look, bark patterns tell you an awful lot about the tree. The crackling on it tells you a lot about the tree. Here's an example of an apple that was not in an orchard that came back unique unknown. This is on fashionable 3rd Avenue in Durango. Will and Vicky Coase, super nice people there. It ties to historic people in Durango. It's a good high quality apple. We wanted to go ahead and graft it. We DNA'd it. It came back unique unknown. This may have been a seedling. We will never know unless we find another sample that matches it. We talk about seedlings, and we were trying not to do any of these with DNA, but we see a lot of really high quality seedlings growing around Colorado. Any old orchard district will have them. This is a sort of red tinged flesh apple. This is a soft tannin apple, very astringent, puckering. I think it's a great baking one. You can eat it fresh. I think it'll be a great cider apple. We haven't named that one yet. This, like the Colorado orange, was growing in a row. We think the graft died early on, they let it grow. Produced absolutely purple apples. We've named this one Purple Mountain Majesty. Absolutely love this apple. This is one of my favorites. This is a seedling growing by the cabin of Six-Finger Jack, so we named the apple Six-Finger Jack. Big, blocky, high sugar, not sweet, but high sugar apple. This was grown in the town of Dolores, but the one-legged blacksmiths, it's the home of the one-legged blacksmith. Beautiful little red apple, very raspberry kind of flavor. This is grown on 28 Road in Montezuma County, so it's 28 miles from the Utah border. The sun has come up all the way across Colorado. By the time it gets to this, it's a beautiful yellow apple, golden yellow apple, tinged with red, blushed with red. So we named this guy the Colorado Sunrise. The original of this tree is gone now. So what happens a lot. We'll find these seedlings, you think they're going to be there forever, and they're not. Sometimes you find trees, and sometimes the tree finds you. Okay? We had an article about us in the local paper years ago. We got a call from somebody with an old sounding voice saying, "This is Maxine Welch. I have the probably last Cedar Hill black apple tree around." We couldn't make out her phone number. Time went by, we thought maybe it was a local seedling from down there. When we got the sandstone surveys from the 1920s, lo and behold, on the Canyon City one was Cedar Hill black. We're like, holy crap, it's a real apple. It really existed. So we went, found the tree, Maxine Welch, unfortunately by that time had passed, but we got permission to go there, get a graft of it. We did a DNA on this. This came back matching a sample of Virginia Beauty, another rare old tree. Is the Cedar Hill black and the Virginia Beauty the same apple? Genetically, they may well be. Culturally, they are not. Culturally, the Cedar Hill black is a different apple than the Virginia Beauty, and it always will be. We grow with these trees. These trees are dependent on us to keep them alive and keep them growing. We can have something that we think came from someplace else, but as it grows with us culturally into what we have, it grows across generations of people, it becomes something different. Here's another one that people said they always knew what it was. You see in Spencer Beach's apples in New York, he has a different listing with colored plate and descriptions for Gano, for Black Ben Davis, and for Ben Davis. You see these on county fair records all across Colorado is listed out as 3 different apples. When we DNA tested them, every single Gano and every single Black Ben we had all came back as Ben Davis. Were they all sports of each other? I don't know. We just saw in the wax apple collection, Ben Davis, Black Ben, in Gano. The Gano and Ben Davis look a lot like Ben Davis. The Black Ben look different. Ben Davis, when in the 1880s, things started going more to monoculture back east. The Ben Davis was the main crop apple for the south. The Baldwin was for the north. Much like Delicious now, these get a bad reputation. When people from back east would have these in Colorado, they didn't know what they were. They were like, what is this great high-quality apple? And when they told them it was a Ben Davis, people thought they were pulling their legs. They couldn't believe that it was the same apple that they knew was a not great apple from back east. They say in the South, when the South ran out of ammo, cannon shot in the Civil War, they would load their cannons with Ben Davis and blast out those. Here's an apple we found in an old orchard north of Cortez. We're going along, we see a round red apple, so we're like, Rome, but in the next tree, Rome. And then we start looking at it, it's like, okay, it's got little dots on it. Rome doesn't have that. It's got this big, beautiful bark like a bear took to it. This was originally called the Senator. This was originally called the Oliver, and then Stark got it, named it the Senator. This apple was on the transition between very diverse orchards and monoculture. Unfortunately for it, it fell on the wrong side of the line. It's a really high-quality apple, and we've often thought if Stark hadn't patented it, it would have kept growing in regional nurseries, and you probably would know that apple better today. This is one that absolutely should be grown more. It's just a blow away, well-flavored apple. So along the line, it occurred to us, what happened to all of this? We know that Colorado could grow some of the best quality fruit on earth. Our hot daytime temperatures, our cool nighttime temperatures allowed the fruit to set its sugars in a way that doesn't happen in other places. The beautiful sunny days kept a lot of the diseases and problems of apples away from us. We knew that these apples grew here because they still grow here. And even though a lot of these trees have gone feral and been abandoned, they still produce high quality fruit. So what happened to all of these varieties? What happened to this tremendous orchard economy that happened over a lot of Colorado? This was a great big question that vexed us. Why don't we eat Colorado apples? Yeah, there's still some grown in Delta, but it's not everywhere. The answer to this was more or less right under our nose. This tree had a graft line down low, and then up higher they grafted it again, or top worked it, as it was known. It was originally an old-fashioned line sap that was then top worked into a delicious. They did this, yeah. So why would they do this? Why would they take all of these great old varieties and switch them to this other type of apple? Partially, it's what they were being taught to do. The eminent horticulturist here at W.S. Coburn was out teaching people to top work. Remember, when everything went towards unified commercial crop production, what mattered was how many you could produce, not how high of quality or how unusual you could produce. The irony of this picture is that we now know that the parent of the delicious is not yellow bellflower, but it was in fact the wine sap. Following the Civil War, America went from a nation of farmers and an agricultural society to an industrial society. All of the subtleties of summer varieties and winter varieties and summer and fall and winter varieties fell off. All that mattered was the apple could be shipped to people that lived farther and farther from the farms. These delicious became the most dominant apple. They could grow anywhere. They grew better in Colorado than most places, but we could not compete with the commodity. The Rome Beauty is still one of the best, most productive apples ever grown in Colorado. When you're out in orchards, you'll see a round red apple. Guarantee you that's it a lot of the times. The Jonathan, though, being an old apple, was able to regain prominence because it wound up being a great pollinator for the delicious, and because it also wound up cropping slightly earlier than the delicious. When they switched to these really straight 3-variety monocultural orchards, these were more set up for catastrophic frost. When they didn't frost, though, they could produce humongous crops. Montezuma County was shipping apples into California in the 1950s. In the 1960s, truckers would drive up from Texas, load up their trucks, and haul them back down to Texas where they'd go across the borders. These are beautiful park-like orchards. There's something really extraordinary to see. This type of orchard is going to go extinct. We will not see these again. So why does any of this matter? Why do we care about these old varieties? Right now, growers in Delta County are not able to compete with growers in South America. Kroger will buy their Fujis and Galas from South America before they will buy them from Colorado. Washington State just released the Cosmic Crisp. Within a couple of years, they're going to be dumping 20 million bushels a year of Cosmic Crisp on the market. Colorado growers can't grow that apple for 10 years, okay? We are not going to survive trying to compete on the commodity market with everyone else. But we do have these old varieties that have proven themselves here, that have a place here and have a market future. Most people do not know the difference between a Fuji and a Gala, but they do know a good story when they hear it, and most people will buy into a good story. These apples deserve another chance, and there is a market reason for giving them the other chance. I love the diversity you see in this picture, from these softer bruised summer apples to the very hard red ones there in the side. It shows you a great snapshot of what was actually grown and can be grown in Colorado. If we are going to save our orchard economy and rebuild it in the state, I really believe it's going to be coming off of what happened before. So one of the things we realized early on was that we're working with a tree, and if we want to be able to get these things available to people, we've got to have more than a tree. So initially we started by planting preservation orchards. Our first was at the historic Gold Medal Orchard down in McElmo. We got this listed on the Colorado Preservation Inc.'s Most Endangered Place in 2015. It's the first time they ever put a cultural landscape on their Most Endangered Place list. This year we won an award for progress on it. We also have them at the CSU orchards at Yellow Jacket in Montezuma County and up in Delta County. Besides getting these out to where growers and consumers can see and trial these apples, it also increases our availability of cyanwood for these apples. Our newest preservation orchard is there in Dolores, across the road from the one-legged blacksmith shop. Eventually, this orchard will have an app and a map with it that will tie to the orchards around Montezuma County so that people can go cider tasting, fruit picking, hit produce stands, whatnot. We would like to see these kind of community orchards going all across the state that all tie with each other and tell the story of what's happening. We probably whip and tongue graft almost all of our trees. We probably graft about 15, this last year was more like 1,700 trees. We used to, in the past, graft out some of the better known heirlooms. We've been switching over the last couple of years to just work on the rarest of the rare. Other people can grow an ash meats kernel. We have very rare, genetically DNA-proven material that no one else has, and no one else has the ability right now to grow out. So we really feel like if we don't do this, these varieties are going to go away. One of the coolest things, and sometimes one of the saddest things we get to do, is put trees back where they came from. This was an instance where the person was dying of cancer that told us where he wanted us to plant the tree. Sometimes they're very happy. This is Will and Vicky Coe over in Durango. Will's in his 90s. He will probably never see apples off of this tree, but he's glad to know that something is being passed forward. 100 years from now, people can enjoy this tree. Doesn't matter who planted it. What matters is the tree will be there for people. We were at this old orchard north of Cortez, and there was the help trailer and little family there. Mom, dad, kid, another one on the way, and the mom asked, "Are the apples safe to eat?" It wasn't because they had been sprayed in decades. It was because they didn't have a barcode on them, therefore they could not possibly be picked off a tree and eaten. There's 7 elementary schools in the Cortez School District. Every single one of them has an orchard, as does the historic Battle Rock Charter School, as does Southwest Open High. The middle school has a 70-tree orchard. We also teach grown-ups. They're always a little harder, but we teach grown-ups grafting classes too. There's a lot of places in rural Colorado that have land and water enough for orchards to happen. and can have an economic revival through orchards if they are given the skills to do it. So finally, one of our biggest problems with getting people to plant new orchards of these old trees is that in Montezuma County, we conservatively estimate a 50,000 bushel capacity right now hitting the ground. If those were 10 cents a pound on the tree, that's a $200,000 a year crop. At 50 cents a pound on the tree, that is $1 million a year crop hitting the ground doing nothing, okay? We've identified the big need is aggregate infrastructure and a way to process it. So we're in the process of trying to buy a place that will give us the place to bring the apples, sort the apples, process the apples to where then Walmart, City Market, Safeway can backhaul them with their empty trucks out of Montezuma County. This will also give us a place to plant out multiple varieties of these trees so that they can grow into perpetuity. If we do not grow these trees out forever, these trees are going to go away. The third part of this is one of the most important parts of this. Right now there's a plan with the Colorado Division of Water Resources to pay farmers not to farm so that the water can go into a water bank in Powell. This will presumably be paid for by raising taxes mostly on you here on the Front Range. The state's concern is that if there's a call on the river, farmers are going to lose their water whether they like it or not. Nature Conservancy was trying to find a crop that could be grown in the upper basins that did not require as much water but would keep farmers farming. We kind of fell into their lap with this, with orchards. What we see this being is a prototype where we will plant these old-style orchards at 25-foot spacing with drought-tolerant buffalo and blue grama grasses and other native grasses with lots of wildflowers underneath so that these will be drought-tolerant, water-conserving, pollinator-friendly places. Nature Conservancy is helping us out a lot with this. We still have some shortfall we're trying to do. We do have some information if you guys want. We really believe in what we're doing. We feel like we are making an enormous amount of progress. We know there's a lot of work to do. We are not intimidated by what needs to happen. We believe in it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jude. It's pretty inspirational, and I kind of there's so much things to think about how to get this going on the Front Range as well. We're gonna call all the speakers up to the panel at the last bit, so there'll be time to ask questions of all the speakers that we hear. But right now, I want to break and take 25 minutes to have a poster session. You can talk to any of the speakers that you'd like. Also, the students will be by the posters. So a little bit of a background. These are students from a class that we held this fall, and it's an initiative at CU to get people the first experience in research and in science, but really instead of sitting in a lecture hall and memorizing whatever biology class you need to memorize. Actually getting experience working with the community, asking questions that are needed, and learning how to do science that way. So I think local apples are a really good model for those efforts. There's projects on the genetics of our local apples, the special ecophysiology of them, and also the urban ecology and the adaptations that we're seeing in them. So please get some food, mingle, and we'll get you all back a little after 3:30. Thank you.